Have you ever been so essential to a place that you believed it could never function without you, until the moment they proved otherwise? That question echoed in my mind as I stood in the middle of the conference room, staring at the polished table where I'd spent years of my life solving problems no one else could even define. Ethan, the company's moving in a new direction. Your position has been deemed redundant, effective immediately. The words came from Nicole Harrington, the new chief operating officer, her voice calm, clipped, and utterly indifferent. HR sat beside her, avoiding eye contact. I didn't argue. I didn't ask why. I just nodded once. 17 years. Not a warning. Not a thank you. Just a printed document and a cardboard box. I left the room in silence. But I wasn't done. Not by a long shot. You see, they thought they were closing a chapter. They didn't realize they were setting the prologue for something much bigger. This wasn't the end of my story. It was the beginning of theirs, and I had just started writing the first sentence. I stepped out into the parking lot, the late summer heat of Austin pressing down on the back of my neck. The sun was bright, almost mocking. It felt like the kind of day where nothing should go wrong, and yet everything just had. I sat in my car for a while, staring at the sleek glass exterior of the building I had practically helped build from the inside out. My name is Ethan Ross. I'm 50 years old, and until 37 minutes ago, I was the director of network infrastructure at Axis Freight Systems, one of the fastest-growing logistics firms in the country. I had been with the company since it was just a glorified shipping startup operating out of 2 rented floors in a commercial complex on the outskirts of town. 18 years. 18 years of building secure systems from scratch, migrating data across unstable platforms, rewriting code at 2 a.m. because a server hiccuped before a major product launch. I knew every router, every vulnerability, every custom patch applied after hours because the budget wouldn't cover a full upgrade. I'd trained most of the current team, mentored the young engineers, sat in every emergency briefing, and quietly pulled the company out of disaster more times than anyone cared to remember. I was never flashy. I didn't play politics. I didn't grandstand in meetings. I believed if I worked hard, kept the systems running, and looked out for the people beneath me, that would be enough. I believed in merit, loyalty, in letting your work speak for itself. I also believed naively that people noticed, but people don't notice what works flawlessly. They notice what fails, and they look for someone to blame. Or in Nicole Harrington's case, someone to remove before they start asking the wrong questions. She'd joined Axis just 6 months ago, all sharp suits and buzzwords: digital transformation, agile integration, system synergy. She spoke in frameworks, not facts. At first, I welcomed the change. The company had been growing too fast with no clear direction, and a little order seemed like the right call. But soon, I started seeing the signs. The shift in energy. Closed-door meetings I wasn't invited to. Vendors I hadn't approved showing up on network invoices. Key team members reassigned without explanation. And most telling of all, access. Slowly, almost imperceptibly, my administrative permissions began to change. Nothing obvious. Just a few restrictions here. A delay in. A clearance update there. I noticed. I documented. I didn't say a word. Andrea, my wife, had seen the change in me. "You're sleeping less," she said one night as we sat on the back porch, the cicadas droning in the humid air. "You're quieter. Something wrong at work?" I shrugged and gave the same answer I'd given 100 times before. Just growing pains. Nothing I can't handle. But I was wrong. This wasn't just change. This was a shift. A deliberate move to erase what had come before, and maybe, just maybe, to hide something under the noise of modernization. Now, sitting in the car with my box of belongings, my daughter's drawing, the stress ball shaped like a TCP/IP diagram, the mug Jamie gave me when he joined the team, I realized I hadn't been let go because I was obsolete. I'd been let go because I knew too much, and because I was the one person in that building who could follow a trail no one else even knew existed. They wanted me gone. That was their first mistake. They thought that removing me from the building meant removing me from the system. But I never left the system. I built it. The official meeting had lasted less than 7 minutes. But the unraveling had begun weeks before. It started with a calendar invite that popped up late Sunday evening. Subject line: Staffing Review, Executive Directive. That alone would have raised flags, but the meeting location was what sealed it. Conference Room Delta, 2nd floor. Not HR's office, not my department. Somewhere deliberately neutral, deliberately cold. When I walked in Monday morning, Nicole was already seated, back straight, tablet in hand. Beside her sat Raymond Tran from Human Resources, clipboard, pen, zero eye contact. Let's get straight. To it, Nicole said without greeting. We're undergoing restructuring. After a comprehensive operational audit, your position has been deemed duplicative and no longer aligned with future strategy. I knew that language. Polished, sanitized, corporate theater. Duplicative meant they wanted someone cheaper. Not aligned meant someone who didn't challenge decisions. I asked nothing, offered no resistance. I knew better than to argue with a process already set in motion. You'll receive a formal notice by email. We'll need your badge, your devices, and your access tokens by the end of today. That was the only time Raymond spoke, and he sounded like he was reading off a script. I nodded once. No expression. No questions. I knew anything I said would either be written down or held against me. I also knew this wasn't really about performance. It wasn't even personal. It was structural, efficient, precise, bloodless. The kind of decision that made investors nod approvingly. Back at my desk, my team barely made eye contact. A few gave me sympathetic glances, but mostly people just looked busy. It was easier that way. For them, for me. No one wants to witness the end of something that looks too much like their own future. I packed slowly, methodically. My system's login still worked. That was curious. Usually, terminations triggered an automatic revocation protocol. The fact that it hadn't kicked in yet told me something. They were in a rush, or they had underestimated just how tightly I was woven into everything. Jamie, the junior analyst I had hired 2 years ago, hovered near my cubicle. This doesn't make sense, he whispered. You're the one who trained me. You know where all the skeletons are. I gave him a faint smile. That's exactly why. He looked stunned, unsure whether I was joking. I wasn't. As I slid my coffee mug into the box, I spotted something tucked behind the monitor. An old photo of the original server room. Me and 2 other guys, back when we were setting up bare metal racks by hand and labeling switches with masking tape. Before anyone cared about uptime or scalability or remote access policies, a knock on the cubicle wall pulled me from the memory. It was Nicole. We'll need to collect your credentials before you leave. I assumed so, I said, handing over the security badge and key fob. But not the flash drive in my pocket. That one stayed with me. She paused, studying me as if waiting for a reaction. Anger, desperation, maybe even tears. She got none of that. You don't seem surprised, she finally said. I'm not, I replied, and I wasn't. The truth is, I'd felt this coming. The subtle shifts, the silences, the way I was slowly airbrushed out of conversations I used to lead. At some point, I stopped being seen as a pillar and started being viewed as a liability. Too experienced, too entrenched, too observant. Still, knowing it was coming didn't make it any easier. I carried the box out the front door, past the new biometric scanners I'd recommended 3 years ago, down the polished hallways whose floor plans I'd helped redesign after the second expansion. Every piece of the infrastructure inside that building bore some trace of me. My decisions, my mistakes, my long nights. But the people in charge now didn't care about that. Legacy wasn't on their balance sheets. I reached my car, placed the box in the back seat, and sat for a moment in the driver's seat, engine off, hands resting on the wheel. Then I opened my phone, tapped into a secure folder, and began scrolling through archived logs, access histories, software flags, authorization trails that hadn't made sense 6 months ago, but now gleamed like breadcrumbs. I had spent 18 years making sure Axis Freight ran like a machine. Now it was time to figure out who had been tampering with the gears. The logs told me what my instincts had suspected for months. Quiet changes, invisible edits. A slow erosion of control that at the time felt like oversight, but now looked a lot like strategy. 6 months ago, I'd noticed that one of our critical permissions trees had been altered. A minor flag buried in a code audit report showed that someone had reassigned root privileges on our finance servers. It had struck me as odd at the time, but not worth raising alarm. We were in the middle of an enterprise-wide system upgrade, and things like that happened occasionally, or so I told myself. But now, staring at that same log file on my screen, I noticed the change had been authorized not by anyone in IT, but by Nicole herself, and she hadn't done it alone. The name L. Martinez appeared next to hers in multiple change logs, always tied to security improvements or efficiency protocols. At the time, I assumed it was a contractor. Nothing unusual. We had vendors rotating in and out constantly. But Leo Martinez wasn't just another outside tech consultant. He was the architect behind NaviSync Solutions, one of several new software vendors that had somehow slipped into our procurement chain without passing through the usual approvals. I remembered the first time I saw him. Tall, well-dressed, full of charm and corporate polish. He shook hands with everyone and complimented the building's lighting. People like Leo don't get hired for technical depth. They get hired to tell decision-makers what they already want to hear, wrapped in better vocabulary and with just enough jargon to sound credible. He'd been introduced during a department meeting as a strategic partner in our digital transformation. I remember how he had said those words like a salesman rehearsing a pitch he'd already delivered 20 times that week. When I asked about technical specs and integration risks, Nicole had waved me off gently but firmly. "Don't worry, Ethan," she'd said with a half-smile. "Leo's here to modernize our back-end systems. Think of him as a supplement, not a replacement." The irony. But the most telling change hadn't been software. It had been silence. My inbox, once flooded with update chains, deployment plans, and budget review threads, had started to quiet down. My name disappeared from distribution lists I'd created. Meetings were rescheduled without me. Status reports were shared with my team leads, not with me. The operations I'd managed for years were now operating as if I didn't exist. And then there was Jamie. A month before I was fired, he stopped by my desk one morning holding a tablet and looking pale. "Ethan," he said quietly, I know they've moved our firewall logs to a cloud dashboard." I blinked. "Without informing security?" That's what I thought. But Leo said it was faster. Said it's part of the new risk mitigation protocol. Risk mitigation protocol. Another buzzword. Another decision made without the people who actually understood the risks. I told Jamie to document everything he could and email it to himself using a private account. Not because I suspected a conspiracy yet, but because something was wrong. Something in the rhythm of the place had shifted. The kind of shift you don't notice right away, like a building that creaks a little louder each day until the beams snap all at once. The final clue came 2 weeks before I was terminated. I was running a scheduled diagnostic on our data redundancy systems when I noticed something strange. A new vendor integration had been labeled as a trial partner, but there was no corresponding entry in the financial ledger. That should have been impossible. Every vendor, even for short-term pilots, had to be logged, tagged, and budgeted. Tried to access the financial registry but got an access denial. Strange, I thought. I had built that system. My permissions were root level, or at least they used to be, so I went around it. I used an archived copy of the legacy system from our local backups, an old version that wasn't connected to our active server. There, hidden in plain sight, were multiple payment entries to NaviSync Solutions, starting small, then increasing by 10 to 15% each month. Over time, the totals added up to hundreds of thousands of dollars. And the approval signatures? Nicole Harrington, Leo Martinez, and disturbingly, the CFO's office. I sat back, exhaled slowly, and looked out the window. They weren't just streamlining the company, they were gutting it from the inside. And firing me? That wasn't a strategic realignment. It was a preemptive strike. That night I sat in my home office, the door closed, lights dimmed, the only sound a quiet hum from the desktop tower I had custom-built years ago, more out of habit than need. I wasn't in the mood for dinner. Andrea didn't ask. She knew, me too well. When I get quiet like this, it means something's unraveling behind my eyes. I opened the drawer on the right side of my desk, the one I kept locked, and pulled out an old metal flash drive. No brand label, matte black casing. This wasn't company property. It had never touched a Meridian-issued device. Years ago, when the legal team had asked for a system that could detect insider threats, I had quietly implemented audit protocols and off-site backups. With approval, yes, but no one remembered that now. They thought I was just the aging infrastructure, guy with long-winded emails and too many legacy habits. Good. That's what I wanted them to think. I plugged in the drive and started reviewing. Everything was still there. Access logs, backup configs, routing tables, financial system mirrors. I had built our systems like a living, breathing organism, resilient, redundant, aware of intrusions. And when they began slowly shutting me out, of those systems they didn't realize that I had left myself shadows. Ghost access, mirror points, quietly maintained for moments just like this. The files I found on Navisync Solutions painted a clear picture. Over the last 9 months, payments had been increasing steadily, from $12,000 in the first quarter to $47,000 in the most recent. Always billed under software optimization consulting. Always signed off by a rotating pair of names. Nicole, Harrington and Brian Knox, our CFO, but Navisync had no footprint. The company website was a single page with a generic mission statement and no team listed. The street address was a virtual office space in Atlanta, shared with 24 other shell entities. When I traced the business registration, it led to a holding company, Shoregate Partners, registered in Delaware. I'd worked long enough in corporate infrastructure to know that when money starts flowing through Delaware LLCs, it's not about tax optimization. It's about hiding things. Digging deeper, I found something worse. One of the internal spreadsheets included a line item labeled contingency coverage, Tier 2 escalation. It was buried in the middle of a vendor payout list, easy to miss, unless you knew what to look for. The amount, $18,500, recurring every 30 days. That was odd. None of our actual vendors used language like that. I followed the transaction path. The account receiving those payments was under the name MLH Security Consulting. I'd never heard of them, but I had heard of the person who registered the business. Leo Martinez. He wasn't just involved. He was moving money through multiple fronts, likely setting up a buffer for payouts. I wasn't looking at a simple markup scheme. I was looking at embezzlement dressed up as innovation. And Nicole? She wasn't just complicit. She was signing off on every single transfer. But this wasn't the kind of thing I could expose with a dramatic email. If I fired too early, they'd spin it as a disgruntled ex-employee's revenge tale. I'd be painted as unstable, bitter, irrelevant. No. If I was going to do this, it had to be surgical, precise, irrefutable. So I started building a case. Each night for the next 3 days, I compiled a report, logs, screenshots, vendor approvals, timelines. I used my old secure scripting tools to cross-reference metadata from emails, payment schedules, and access records. I created a folder titled Cascade, split it into subfolders named for each person involved, and backed it up across multiple cloud services under anonymous credentials. Then I made one phone call, Cynthia Moss. She was a board member, formerly chief compliance officer at a different firm, and someone I had worked closely with during our last internal security audit. She wasn't flashy, but she was sharp, and more importantly, she had asked the right questions when no one else did. I trusted her enough to take a risk. "Cynthia," I said when she answered, "I need 10 minutes of your time off the record." There was a pause. "You're not with the company anymore, Ethan." "I know. That's why this conversation matters." She sighed. "What is this about?" "Fraud. Embezzlement. and a systems compromise that was never reported to the board. Now there was silence on the other end. "Where do we meet?" she asked. We met at a small coffee shop in South Austin, somewhere discreet. I brought a sealed envelope with a flash drive inside and a printed summary of the most basic findings, enough to validate the situation, but not enough to burn the whole thing down. She read through the first few pages, her expression darkening. "How long has this been going on?" "Best guess, 18 months, maybe longer." "Why come to me?" "Because you're the only person in that room who still knows what oversight means." She nodded slowly, tucking the folder into her bag. "What's your angle, Ethan?" "No angle, no settlement, no revenge fantasy. I just want this exposed. The right way. No spin." Her mouth curved into something resembling a smile. "You always were dangerous when quiet." I stood to leave. "One more thing," she said. "What if this blows back on you?" "It already did," I replied. And then I walked out, the weight of the plan settling into place like the final piece of code in a system designed to catch fire only when the time was right. By the time I got home that night, a storm had rolled in, thunder rumbling in the distance, the kind that made windows tremble. Fitting, I thought. Nature was catching up with what was brewing beneath the surface at Axis Freight. I sat back down at my desk and began to lay the digital groundwork for what came next. If Cynthia moved forward, if she brought the evidence to the board, it would trigger questions. But questions weren't enough. I didn't just want them rattled. I wanted the corruption pinned down with no exits left to slip through. These people had cut me loose thinking I'd disappear quietly. Instead, I had every intention of turning their system against them. The first thing I did was create a new email address, something internal-looking, plausible. I bought a domain name that mimicked our internal IT format, accessnetworksupport.com. Close enough to look official, different enough to slip under filters. If someone wasn't paying attention, then I created a spoofed user profile, James D. Collier, Systems Analyst. Not real, of course, but with just enough digital history behind it to survive scrutiny for the short time I needed. I populated the inbox with mock system alerts, meeting reminders, even a few auto-forwarded messages to fake departments. The next morning, I scheduled the first move. At exactly 9:15 a.m., just before the leadership team's weekly sync, I sent an email from James D. Collier to Nicole Harrington and Brian Knox. Subject: Flagged vendor discrepancies. Urgent. The body of the message was simple. A brief summary of payment irregularities tied to NaviSync solutions, copied directly from the internal logs, with a link to a private, admin-only dashboard I had hosted on a secured sandbox server. The dashboard mimicked our corporate interface but contained just enough redacted data to be credible and to set off alarm bells. By 9:27 a.m., Nicole had opened the email. By 9:30, so had Brian. And at 9:33, Brian called Leo Martinez. I watched it all unfold via metadata pings. They were running scared, exactly what I needed. What they didn't know was that Cynthia had already scheduled a closed-door session with the board's compliance subcommittee for that afternoon. She was careful, discreet and smart. I trusted her to stay silent until the moment counted. All I had to do was keep pressure on the system, keep the snakes moving in daylight so they couldn't slither underground when the trap snapped shut. Just before noon, I received an email on my personal account. No subject line, no signature. Read, "You need to stop. This will not end the way you think." I stared at it for a while, then smiled. Fear, when disguised as control, always speaks without punctuation. Still, I knew I had to be precise. One misstep and they'd spin the whole thing. I'd be labeled the disgruntled former employee trying to ruin reputations after being let go for performance misalignment. That phrase had already appeared in my HR exit paperwork, buried beneath all the boilerplate. I'd highlighted it. They were building a defense before I'd even made a move, so I made sure they had nothing to stand on. That afternoon, I prepared a second wave of documentation. This time I took a risk and sent it directly to the interim general counsel, someone I'd never spoken to, Monica Reyes. I didn't identify myself. I simply sent an anonymous upload link labeled "For Internal Review, Axis Fraud Structure," and attached a clean package: vendor trails, payment cycles, LLC ownership records, metadata logs, and, most importantly, correspondence pulled from old server archives I had backed up long before my credentials were revoked. One email in particular stood out. It was from Nicole to Leo. Subject: Clean break. Message: Ethan is legacy code. He's not part of the future. Let's move quickly. Get the approvals wrapped while we still have runway. I almost admired the audacity, but what really stunned me was the timestamp. It had been sent 3 weeks before I was let go. They'd already planned it. Not just the termination, but the cleanup. My firing wasn't a cost decision. It was a risk mitigation strategy. That made their mistake even more satisfying. Because I wasn't legacy code. I was the failsafe. By the time the board convened at 4 p.m., Cynthia had all the pieces she needed. The trap was set. And just in case someone tried to pull a vanishing act, I triggered one last protocol, a series of timed disclosures scheduled through a secure cloud relay. If anything happened to me, or if certain files were accessed without proper credentials, those disclosures would go directly to 3 destinations: an SEC case review inbox, a trusted investigative journalist I knew from my college days, and a legal contact who specialized in corporate whistleblower protection. Overkill? Maybe. But I wasn't taking chances. They had pushed me out thinking they were removing a threat. They didn't realize they were creating one. One with nothing left to lose. One who knew every door they thought they'd locked behind them. And now, for the first time in weeks, I felt calm. The storm had passed, but the flood hadn't even begun. By the following morning, Axis Freight had no idea it was already hemorrhaging credibility. From the outside, everything appeared calm. Daily stand-ups, budget syncs, inboxes filled with KPIs and market forecasts. But beneath the surface, the pressure was building like a fault line under glass. At exactly 8:59 a.m., the boardroom lights flickered on. A quarterly finance review was scheduled, complete with investor talking points and a presentation from Brian Knox. I knew the script. I'd sat through enough of those meetings to predict every slide, but what they hadn't predicted was that their meeting would never reach slide 3. At 9 a.m. sharp, my second email, sent via the spoofed internal domain, landed in the inboxes of the board, legal counsel, and the audit committee. Subject: Before you approve Q3 bonuses, immediate attention required. The body was brief, concise. It listed only 3 bullet points. Over $700,000 in unapproved payments to shell entities since Q1 Pont, 2 companies, NaviSync Solutions and MLH Consulting, linked to personal associates of Axis executives. Attached, preliminary report including financial records, digital audit logs, and internal communications. At 9:06 a.m., Brian Knox abruptly left the boardroom. At 9:08, Nicole Harrington was seen in a private call outside her office, pacing fast, and by 9:12, my phone buzzed. Unknown caller. I let it ring out. Seconds later, a voicemail appeared. It was Brian. Ethan, or whoever this is, if you're trying to pull something reckless, just know the company will defend itself. We have legal avenues. If you're behind this, you're making a serious mistake. He sounded breathless, rattled. I played the message again, slower this time, listening not to the words but the tone, panic with a gloss of professionalism. Good. They were finally feeling what I had felt that Monday morning, walking out with a box of my life while they pretended I had simply become inconvenient. But I wasn't done yet. At 10:15, Cynthia texted me from her encrypted Signal app. Just one word. Confirmed. That meant the board had reviewed the initial evidence and deemed it serious enough to halt all current approvals. Nicole and Brian had been asked to step away from the rest of the meeting. An internal investigation had been authorized, immediately. Meanwhile, chaos spread quietly through the back channels of Axis. Vanessa from HR, who'd sat silently in the room during my termination, sent an email to the company's compliance inbox asking if she should pause onboarding for new vendor profiles until further notice. She knew something was wrong. HR people always do. They don't talk, but they read everything. They hear the things leaders assume no one notices. The tone, the language, the urgency. At 11, Leo Martinez sent a message to an internal Slack channel shared with a few mid-level project managers. Need to meet urgently. Alignment required. Top-down clarification coming soon. He was spinning. His contract wasn't even official yet, technically still under third-party review. He wasn't an employee, but he'd been signing off on integrations like one. I knew because I'd watched him do it. What they hadn't realized yet, what they still didn't understand, was that their digital trail didn't stop at permissions. It echoed. Every login attempt, every email header, every packet routed through our cloud platform. I'd set the whole system up with an immutable shadow log required during a Department of Transportation audit 4 years ago. And like most audit tools, it had been ignored once the pressure passed, but I never turned it off, and that meant every step they took now was being mapped. Just after noon, I got a message from Jamie. They're saying someone hacked the boards. Email. Legal is panicking. IT pulled down parts of the finance dashboard. Nicole hasn't come out of her office in an hour. What's going on? I stared at the screen, then typed back one line. Don't ask questions. Don't take sides, just observe. He didn't respond. Smart kid. By 2 p.m., the real fire began. A media inquiry was forwarded to the company's press contact. A journalist from the Austin Ledger had submitted a list of specific questions about vendor spending and third-party contractor reviews. Someone had tipped them off, not me. Not yet, but that was the moment I knew momentum was no longer mine alone. This wasn't just a digital investigation anymore. It was becoming public. And once the public gets a scent of internal rot, especially at a company built on logistics, trust, and large-scale contracts, the rot spreads fast. At 3:30, Nicole finally broke silence. An email was sent from her office to all department heads. Axis remains committed to transparency and ethical governance. Recent claims regarding vendor discrepancies are being taken seriously and reviewed in accordance with policy. We ask all employees to refrain from speculation and continue with daily operations as normal. It was the kind of message written for optics, not clarity. A placeholder. A stalling tactic, but they were already too late. By 4:10, a second board session had been called, emergency attendance only. I wasn't invited. I didn't need to be. My job was never to walk into the fire. It was to light the fuse. And now, all I had to do was sit back and wait for the structure they had built, on stolen money, borrowed titles, and paper-thin lies, to start coming down floor by floor. I had expected the fire to spread. What I hadn't anticipated was how fast the smoke would reach people I hadn't even targeted. The morning after the emergency board session, I woke up to a text from Cynthia. They're freezing all active, third-party vendor payments. Legal team has taken over the investigation. That meant one thing. The board was taking it seriously enough to override the C-suite. But I still had one piece missing. One name. One connection I couldn't pin down. Leo Martinez wasn't smart enough to pull this off alone. Smooth? Sure. Opportunistic? Absolutely. But he wasn't the kind of operator who sets up shell companies, launders payments, and builds digital blind spots into infrastructure. That required structure, inside knowledge, long game thinking. So I went back into my archives, reopened old project timelines, correspondence logs, procurement workflows, and that's when I found it. A contract from 2 years earlier, signed off by the then Chief Technology Officer who had since quietly resigned. Attached was a clause. Authorized consultant approval path may include qualified partner firms for expedited deployment. That clause wasn't just legal filler, it was a key, a loophole, a backdoor channel that allowed select consultants like Leo to onboard without going through traditional procurement scrutiny. I traced the approval trail back and saw a familiar name in the metadata attached to a scanned signature, T. Langston, Tobias Langston, former VP of Systems, a man I hadn't thought about in over a year. Retired early, left with a severance package and a glowing farewell email. No one questioned it. Why would they, except he hadn't retired? At least not fully. His name appeared again, this time as a registered advisor on a quiet little firm called Langmar Solutions LLC, based out of Charleston. The firm held a minority stake in MLH Consulting, the same shell that Leo was using for his contingency coverage payments. That was it. The missing thread. Tobias had laid the foundation. He created the entry point, handed the tools to Leo, and then stepped back just far enough to stay out of the picture. A classic play. Build the tunnel, let someone else crawl through, and watch from a distance while the system collapses. I stared at the screen, adrenaline dull but steady. This wasn't just fraud, it was a coordinated scheme, over multiple fiscal years involving multiple departments executed under the guise of modernization. Axis Freight hadn't just been siphoned, it had been slowly hollowed out. And now, the rot had a name. The twist wasn't just that they had used me as the final scapegoat. It was that they'd needed me gone not because I could stop it, but because I already had. Unintentionally, perhaps. But the systems I had designed, the backup protocols I'd installed, the auditing logic I had left running, those were the things that had caught the irregularities in the first place. Their greatest oversight was assuming the man who built the alarm wouldn't hear it from the outside. By midday, more signals of collapse emerged. Jamie messaged again. It has pulled Leo's credentials. Nicole hasn't returned. They're saying Brian Knox is taking personal leave. This is wild. Then another message, this time from a name I hadn't seen in years. Tobias Langston. It was short. Too short. Let's talk. It's not what you think. I didn't respond. Instead, I archived the message and added it to a new folder labeled Exposure Phase 2. That afternoon, Cynthia called. They've brought in external counsel, independent investigators. It's going to get messy. Good, I said. Ethan, are you sure you want to stay in this? I paused. That was the question, wasn't it? This had started as a quiet act of survival, a reaction to being pushed out, ignored, discarded. But now it wasn't just about me. It was about all the people still inside. People like Jamie. The teams who trusted leadership, who believed their work was part of something legitimate. They nearly dismantled the company from the inside, I said. I can't walk away from that. You might be asked to come back. In some form, Cynthia said carefully. I'm not looking for a job. You might be the only one who can fix what they broke. That I hadn't thought about. I ended the call and sat with the silence for a while. Outside, the late summer sun filtered through the blinds, painting lines across the carpet. The same carpet I'd walked over 1,000 times to fix servers, reroute databases, and stop outages before they even started. But this time the outage wasn't technical. It was ethical. And fixing it might be the most important patch I'd ever have to write. The call came just after 8 a.m. the next morning. Mr. Ross, this is Monica Reyes, General Counsel for Axis Freight. The board would like you to attend a closed session this afternoon regarding the internal findings you've provided. She said findings, but we both knew what she meant. Evidence. The tone of her voice had changed from cautious to careful, like someone walking across a frozen lake, unsure how deep the cracks go. I agreed without hesitation. Not because I needed to be there, but because I needed them to see me, to see what they had tried to erase, to realize what they had allowed to take root under the banner of progress. At 2 p.m., I walked through the same glass doors I'd exited weeks earlier with a cardboard box in hand. This time, my hands were empty, and the weight was on theirs. Security nodded at me with something that looked like recognition, maybe respect, maybe guilt. I didn't care. Upstairs, the executive boardroom was quiet, tense. Cynthia was already seated. Monica stood near the end of the table, a stack of folders beside her. The CEO, interim now, greeted me with a strained nod. Mr. Ross, he began. We appreciate your willingness to speak with us. We've reviewed the documentation submitted anonymously and through board channels. The situation is unprecedented. That word again. They loved unprecedented when what they meant was embarrassing. We've placed multiple executives, including Ms. Harrington and Mr. Knox, on administrative leave pending further investigation, he continued. Outside counsel is now handling what may soon involve federal inquiries. I said nothing. There's also the matter of Mr. Langston, Monica added. He was tied to Langmar Solutions. We've located contracts with possible forged approval trails. So they had followed the trail. Good. Then came the moment I'd predicted. We'd like to offer you a formal consulting role, the interim CEO said, to assist with rebuilding digital compliance, internal controls, and data security protocols. Not just a gesture of thanks. This was a fire alarm pull. They were looking for a parachute before the shareholders saw smoke. I considered the offer for a moment. Not for the title or the paycheck, but because for the first time they weren't asking me to plug holes. They were asking me to rebuild the dam. I'll consider it, I said. But on my terms. He nodded slowly. Name them. I didn't answer right away, because this wasn't the kind of decision you make at the edge of victory. It's the kind you make when you've seen what happens when no one is watching the watchers. I left the room without confirming anything, not yet. But as I stepped back into the elevator, I knew one thing with absolute clarity. Justice wasn't loud. Sometimes it was just quiet enough to be mistaken for silence, until it brought down an entire building. In the weeks that followed, the story unfolded faster than even I expected. Brian Knox quietly resigned. No press release, no farewell message, just a sterile memo from legal thanking him for his years of service. Nicole Harrington tried to hold on longer, issuing a statement about stepping back to allow for transparency. But once the forensic accountants confirmed the vendor trail and the board voted to cooperate fully with federal investigators, she was done. Her name disappeared from the company directory within days. Leo Martinez vanished completely. His last known appearance was at a cafe near the airport. No return flight logged. As for Tobias Langston, his calm facade cracked the moment the SEC got involved. He offered partial cooperation in exchange for immunity. It didn't work. The paper trail was too deep, the conflict of interest too obvious. Cynthia kept me in the loop, but from a distance, professional, respectful, measured. The board approved the creation of a new executive position, Chief Integrity Officer, reporting directly to an independent audit committee. They offered it to me. I said no. Instead, I recommended Jamie. Young, sharp, principled. He just needed someone to show him how to protect the system without becoming cynical about it. I wasn't interested in power. I was interested in prevention. I stayed on as a consultant for 6 months, long enough to rebuild the audit protocols, close the back doors, train the next generation, long enough to know they wouldn't let this happen again. Then I stepped away. Quietly. No headlines. No press statements. Just the way I wanted it. After all, justice doesn't need applause. It just needs to work. Every system, whether built from lines of code or lines of trust, has one silent dependency: belief. The belief that people will do the right thing when no one's watching. That power won't be abused. That loyalty will be rewarded. But systems fail. Not because they break overnight, but because small compromises go unchecked. One shortcut. One overlooked approval. One leader too focused on performance to notice the rot underneath. And the question that lingers, quiet but persistent, is this: what do you do when speaking up might cost you everything, but staying silent could cost everyone else more? It's not hypothetical. It's what many live every day in boardrooms, back offices, and Zoom calls where integrity gets quietly pushed aside. This wasn't a story about revenge. It was about responsibility. About what happens when the person they thought was disposable turns out to be the last line of defense. So if you've ever felt that tension between doing what's safe and doing what's right, you're not alone. And your voice matters more than you think. If this story stayed with you, share your thoughts below. You never know who's reading. Subscribe for more stories that speak softly, but carry truth like a hammer. Because justice doesn't always roar. Sometimes, it just logs everything.